They say getting run out of town is how a man finds his real home. But for Clarice Vaughn, it was how a woman who couldn't have a child was sent to a monster who collected them. The stagecoach wheels screamed to a halt, a sound that echoed the raw, worn-down parts of her soul. Dust settled around the wooden frame, like the shame that had followed her for 3 long days. Ever since Judge Crenshaw had pointed a bony finger at her in the middle of the Cedar Falls town square and pronounced his verdict. He hadn't called it a verdict. He'd called it a mercy. "End of the line, ma'am." The driver's voice had no pity in it, just the tired sound of a man who'd delivered plenty of unwanted cargo to unwanted places. He looked at her in his rearview mirror, his eyes like chipped slate. "Your problem's spiritual, I reckon. 10 miles of road and not one smile at my jokes." Clarice bit her tongue hard. Laughter belonged to people who still had a place in the world. People who hadn't been stripped of their name, their home, and their dignity in front of everyone they'd ever known. Her husband, Thomas, hadn't even met her gaze as the judge spoke. He just stared at the dirt, his face pale, as if she were already a ghost. 10 years, Judge Crenshaw had boomed, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. 10 years this woman has brought a curse of barrenness upon a good man's house. The driver climbed down, his joints creaking, and helped her to the ground. His calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he steadied her wobbling legs. 3 days of riding had left her bones rattling like dice in a cup, but it was nothing compared to the rattling in her chest, the empty, hollow sound where her heart used to be. "Judge's orders," the driver grunted, gesturing with a weathered hand toward a sturdy log cabin nestled in a high mountain meadow. Pine trees stretched up the slopes like green fingers clawing at the sky. A hawk cried its loneliness to the cold October air. "Man lives up here alone. Name's Griffith Cade. If anyone can put you to work, it's him." Work. The word was bitter on her tongue. For 10 years, her only work had been the monthly disappointment of blood, the quarterly visits to Doc Peterson, and the daily ritual of avoiding the pitying stares of women who bounced babies on their hips like it was the easiest thing in the world. The driver set her worn leather satchel at her feet. Inside was everything she owned: 2 dresses, a set of undergarments, her mother's silver brush, and a small Bible that hadn't offered much comfort lately. The weight of it wouldn't have challenged a child, but it felt heavier than her entire life had been just 1 week ago. "What kind of man is he?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded in the vast Colorado wilderness. The driver scratched his grizzled jaw. He looked away toward the dark woods. "Quiet type. Keeps to himself." He paused, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some say he's got a mean streak, a dark one. Been up here nigh on 8 years. Ever since, well," he stopped himself, glancing around as if the trees were listening. "Ever since his wife and little girl vanished without a trace." Clarice felt a cold dread snake down her spine. "Vanished? Folks down in the valley say he did it," the driver muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Said he buried 'em somewhere up on this mountain where no one would ever find 'em. They never found the bodies. Judge Crenshaw himself led the search party. Found nothing but Cade sitting by his fire. Calm as you please." He shook his head. "Point is, he minds his business. You'd be smart to mind yours." The stagecoach lurched back to life with a crack of the reins. Clarice watched it disappear, taking her last connection to the civilized world with it. The silence that followed was absolute. No church bells, no children's laughter, just the wind through the pines. She was alone, exiled, delivered to the doorstep of a man the world believed was a killer, a man who had made his own family disappear. And she had a terrifying thought. Maybe Judge Crenshaw hadn't sent her here for work at all. Maybe he'd sent her here to disappear too. She picked up her satchel and started toward the cabin, each step feeling like she was walking deeper into her own grave. The cabin grew larger, solid logs chinked with clay, a stone chimney trailing smoke. It looked normal. A small barn sat nearby, and chickens pecked at the ground. It was a picture of peace that didn't match the story she'd just been told. The door opened before she reached it. Griffith Cade stepped out, and Clarice felt her breath catch in her throat. He was taller than she'd expected, with shoulders broad enough to fill the entire doorframe. His hands, resting at his sides, looked capable of splitting logs or snapping a neck with equal skill. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples, and his face was weathered from years of mountain winters. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were deep brown, watchful, and utterly devoid of kindness. They weren't the eyes of a grieving husband. They were the eyes of a predator. She braced herself for contempt, for cruelty, for the man the driver had described. But instead he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't touch his hat. He didn't offer a greeting. "Judge Crenshaw sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Yes, sir. I'm Clarice Vaughn." "I know who you are," he said, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if he were sizing up livestock. "The judge sent word, said you needed a place, said you were useful." The way he said the word useful made her skin crawl. "You'll want a roof before nightfall," he said, finally stepping aside. "Supper's on." She followed him through the door, her heart pounding. The cabin's interior was sparse but brutally clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat nearby. But what drew her eye were the shelves. They were lined with books and tools, yes, but also other things. Small, meticulously carved wooden animals, a doll with button eyes, and a single tiny leather shoe worn at the toe. Relics of the family that had vanished. "That room's yours," Griffith said, nodding toward a door on the far side of the room. He didn't look at her. He was busy stoking the fire, his movements economical and powerful. "I cleared it out." She expected a cold corner, a spot in the barn. She opened the door and gasped. The room was small, but it had a real bed with a clean quilt, a washstand, and a trunk for her things. And on the wall there was a drawing, a child's drawing, tacked to the log wall. It showed a tall man, a woman with long brown hair, and a little girl holding their hands. Underneath, in messy letters, it said, "Papa, Mama, Lily." He hadn't cleared it out at all. He had preserved it. It was a shrine. At supper, the stew was so heavily peppered that Clarice coughed violently after her first spoonful, her eyes watering. Griffith looked up from his bowl, his expression unreadable. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer her water. He just watched her choke, a strange, calculating look in his eyes. "Too much for you?" he asked, his voice flat. It has character," she managed to say, her throat burning. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's one way to put it. They ate the rest of the meal in a thick, unnerving silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. When he showed her back to her room, he paused in the doorway. "There are extra blankets in the trunk if you get cold," he said. "Mountain nights are bitter." He looked past her at the child's drawing on the wall. For a split second, a look of raw, unbearable pain crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the same stony mask. "Lock your door," he said, his voice low and hard. The words hung in the air. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. After he closed the door, Clarice didn't cry. She was too scared to cry. She dragged the heavy trunk in front of the door, her hands shaking. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving about the main room. The sounds weren't comforting. They were the sounds of a predator circling its cage. She unpacked her meager belongings, her hands trembling. As she did, something fell out of the folds of her dress. A small folded piece of paper she didn't recognize. She must have picked it up by accident in the chaos of leaving. She unfolded it. It was a receipt from the Cedar Falls General Store. But it wasn't for flour or beans. It was for 3 items, purchased just last week: a shovel, 100 feet of rope, and a large sack of lye. The receipt was signed at the bottom. The signature was clear and unmistakable. Judge Crenshaw, a shovel, rope, and lye. The tools of a man trying to make a body disappear. The judge hadn't sent her here to work. He hadn't sent her here to be a guest. He'd sent her here with a man who had already gotten away with murder once, armed with the very tools needed to do it again. And the most terrifying part? Griffith Cade didn't know she was his next victim. He was just a tool, like the shovel and the rope. The real monster was the man who had pronounced her curse, the man who had sent her here to die. But why? What had she done? What did she know? She looked at the child's drawing on the wall, at the happy family that had simply vanished, and a new, colder fear washed over her. Maybe Griffith Cade wasn't the monster everyone thought he was. Maybe he was the first victim, and she was the second. Dawn came soft and golden, but Clarice hadn't slept. She'd sat in a chair all night, the pistol grip of fear tight in her chest, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. She half expected the door to splinter open, for Griffith Cade to come for her. But all she heard was the wind, and eventually the rhythmic, steady sound of an axe biting into wood. She crept to the window. In the cool morning air, Griffith was splitting logs, his movements powerful and precise. He moved like a man who found solace in hard labor, a man trying to sweat out his demons. She had to get out. She had to run. But where? The nearest town was miles away. Through wilderness, she didn't know. She wouldn't last a day. Her only chance was to play along, to be the useful, obedient woman Judge Crenshaw had promised, to watch and to wait. When she stepped out of her room, the smell of coffee hit her, strong and black. A tin cup was waiting for her on the table. Griffith came in from outside, his shirt damp with sweat, and nodded toward it. "Coffee's on," he said, not meeting her eyes. He went about his morning chores, moving with a restless energy. He never stopped moving. It was as if standing still would allow the ghost to catch up with him. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He gestured toward the barn. "Chickens need feeding. Feed's in the second stall. After that, the water barrels need filling from the creek." He handed her 2 heavy wooden buckets. "Don't wander off the path." Again a warning. The chickens were a welcome distraction, their squawking and flapping a normal sound in a world that felt anything but. As she worked, she scanned the property, the cabin, the barn, the endless wall of pine trees. There was no escape. She felt like one of the chickens, trapped in a coop, waiting for the axe to fall. She spent the day cleaning, cooking, mending, making herself useful. She scrubbed the floors, organized the shelves, and baked biscuits that filled the cabin with a warm, comforting smell. She was trying to build a fortress of domesticity around herself, hoping it would be enough to keep the monster at bay. When Griffith came in for the noon meal, he stopped short. He looked at the clean kitchen, the neat shelves, the plate of golden brown biscuits on the table. He looked confused, as if he'd forgotten what a home was supposed to look like. "Haven't seen it this clean since." He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. The mask of indifference cracked, and for a second, she saw that same look of raw pain. He sat down and ate 4 biscuits, slathering each with butter and honey. He ate like a starving man, not just for food, but for the memory of what it represented. "How long have you been up here alone?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His jaw tightened. The mask was back. 8 years, come November." "That's a long time to be by yourself." "Long enough," he said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. That afternoon while he worked in the barn, Clarice felt a desperate need to know more. Who was this man? Was he the killer the world believed him to be? Or was he something else entirely? She found herself drawn to his room. The door was slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she pushed it open. His room was even more sparse than the rest of the cabin. A bed, a chest, a single shelf of books. On the wall above the bed hung a framed photograph. It was a wedding portrait. Griffith, younger and smiling, stood beside a beautiful woman with Clarice's own long brown hair. And in her arms, she held a baby. Lily. Clarice felt a pang of something she couldn't name. The woman looked so happy, so alive. What had happened to her? She opened the chest at the foot of the bed. It was filled with woman's clothes, neatly folded, smelling of lavender. At the very bottom, tucked beneath a woolen shawl, was a small, leather-bound journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. October 12th. Griffith worries too much. The winters here are harsh, he says, but I feel safer on this mountain than I ever did in town. The people there, they whisper, especially Judge Crenshaw. The way he looks at me makes my skin crawl. He speaks of God's law, but his eyes are full of something else entirely. Clarice's blood ran cold. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning frantically. November 3rd, the judge visited today while Griffith was hunting. He brought a gift for Lily, a doll. He said he wants to be her godfather. He said he feels a special responsibility for us. When I told Griffith, his face grew dark. He told me to never be alone with the judge again. He said the man is a viper. December 1st, something is wrong. The judge knows things he shouldn't. He mentioned the money Griffith has saved, the money hidden under the floorboards for our new start in Oregon. Only Griffith and I knew about that. How could he know? I feel like we're being watched. I feel trapped. The last entry was dated December 15th, the day she and Lily disappeared. Griffith has gone to Denver for supplies. He'll be gone for 2 days. The judge knows he's gone. He just rode up the trail. He says he has come to offer a prayer for our safety. I am afraid. I have locked the door, but I can hear him outside. He is not praying. He is talking to himself. He keeps saying my name. He keeps saying, a curse must be cleansed. Oh God, Griffith, please hurry home. The journal ended there. Clara slammed the book shut, her mind reeling. It wasn't Griffith. It was never Griffith. It was Judge Crenshaw. He hadn't just searched for the missing woman and child. He had been the last person to see them alive. He had orchestrated their disappearance, and now he had sent her here. Another woman with the same brown hair, sent to the same isolated cabin. Why? Was he trying to recreate his crime? Was he trying to frame Griffith again, this time with a body that could be found? A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Griffith Cade stood in the doorway. His face was a thundercloud of fury. His eyes weren't on her. They were on the open journal in her hands. What have you done? He snarled, taking a step into the room. He thought she was just a nosy intruder, violating the sacred memory of his wife. He had no idea she had just discovered the truth, a truth that could get them both killed. I'm sorry, she stammered, backing away. I shouldn't have. Get out, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. He advanced on her, his big hands clenched into fists. For the first time, she saw the monster everyone had whispered about. The rage in his eyes was terrifying. She scrambled out of the room, the journal still clutched in her hand. He followed her into the main room, his presence filling the small space, sucking all the air out. Give it to me, he commanded. No, she whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. You need to read this. You need to know what happened to her. I know what happened, he roared, his voice breaking with 8 years of suppressed agony. She left me. She took my daughter, and she left me. No, she didn't, Clarice cried, her own fear forgotten in the face of his pain. She didn't leave. He took her. Judge Crenshaw, he was here. The night she disappeared. Griffith froze. His face went pale. He stared at her, then at the journal, his mind struggling to process her words. What are you talking about? It's all in here, she said, holding out the book. Her journal. She was afraid of him. He was obsessed with her. He came here the night you were in Denver. He snatched the journal from her hands and began to read. His eyes flew across the pages, his knuckles white. Clarice watched as 8 years of guilt and self-blame were stripped away, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. And then by a rage so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. He looked up from the last entry, his eyes burning with a cold, murderous fire. The pain was still there, but now it had a target. He told the whole territory I drove her away, Griffith said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He led the search party. He stood in my home and offered me his condolences the entire time. The entire time he knew. Suddenly it all clicked into place. Crenshaw's obsession with Griffith's wife, his constant visits, his knowledge of their hidden money, and his final, chilling words. A curse must be cleansed. He saw her as a temptress, a sinner who had to be purged. And now Clarice declared a curse in front of her entire town, sent to the same place. It was a pattern, a ritual. He sent me here to die, she said, the words tasting like ash. He sent me here so you would kill me, and he could finally prove to everyone that you're the monster he always said you were. Griffith looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not just a woman sent to work, but a pawn in a madman's game, a mirror image of the wife he had lost. He won't get the chance, Griffith said, his voice deadly calm. He strode to the fireplace and pulled a loose stone from the hearth. From the hollow behind it, he retrieved an oilskin pouch. He unrolled it on the table, revealing a long-barreled Colt revolver and a box of cartridges. The metal gleamed in the firelight. "We can't just go after him," Clara said, her mind racing. "He's a judge. It's our word against his. Who would believe us?" "I'm not asking for anyone's belief," Griffith said, loading the revolver with grim precision. "I'm delivering a verdict of my own." Just then, a sound from outside cut through the tense silence. The jingle of a harness bell, the crunch of boots in the dirt. They both froze, their eyes meeting in shared alarm. Griffith peered through a crack in the shutters. A grizzled old man with a long white beard was leading a pack mule up the trail. "Landry Croft," Griffith breathed, a hint of relief in his voice. "A prospector. He's a friend." The door opened with a blast of cold air, and Landry stomped in, dusting snow from his coat. "Griffith, you old hermit," he boomed. "Heard tell you had yourself some company for the winter." His eyes fell on Clarice and he swept off his hat. "Landry Croft, ma'am. Don't mind me. I'm just the finest liar and worst cook between here and Denver." His cheerful presence was a strange interruption to the grim atmosphere in the cabin. Clarice forced a smile as Griffith made the introductions. Landry settled himself by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee. He was a gossip, a walking newspaper for the high country, and he launched into a torrent of news from the lower territories. Railroads, cattle barons, claim jumpers. Then his expression grew serious. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Speaking of which," he said, glancing from Griffith to Clarice, "there's something you ought to know, something ugly happening down in the valley. Maybe this ain't talk for a lady." "Miss Vaughn has a right to hear," Griffith said firmly. Landry nodded slowly. "There's rumors," he said, his voice low. "Rumors of a baby farm, operating somewhere up Canyon Creek. Women going in, babies coming out, money changing hands. Terrible business." Clarice felt the blood drain from her face. She'd heard whispers of such places, pits of despair where desperate fallen women were kept like breeding stock, their children sold to the highest bidder. "How sure are you of this?" Griffith asked, his voice tight. "Sure enough," Landry said, his eyes dark. "Seen things that don't sit right. Scared-looking women traveling with hard-faced men. Rich folks from Denver asking questions. And money, lots of money being passed around. They say the man running it is untouchable, has the law in his pocket." "Who?" Griffith demanded. Landry took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at the floor. "The man they say is behind it all is Judge Crenshaw." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. It wasn't just about one woman. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was an industry, a monstrous, profitable enterprise built on the bodies of women and the lives of their children. Crenshaw hadn't just murdered Griffith's wife. He had built an empire on misery, hiding in plain sight behind his robes and his Bible. And suddenly, Clarice understood the real reason she had been cast out. It wasn't because she was barren. That was just the excuse. It was because her husband Thomas, a weak man drowning in debt, had probably sold her to the judge's farm. But something must have gone wrong. Maybe Crenshaw saw Griffith's dead wife in her face, and his old obsession resurfaced. So instead of sending her to the farm, he'd sent her up the mountain, a loose end to be tied up by a supposedly broken man. Her exile wasn't a punishment. It was a business transaction gone sideways. "Canyon Creek," Griffith said, his voice like chipped ice. "The old abandoned mining camp. It's 10 miles south of here." "That's the place," Landry confirmed, nodding grimly. "Perfect place to hide something you don't want found." "Those poor women," Clarice whispered, her hands clenched into fists. For 10 years she'd been shamed for her empty womb. And all that time a man of the law was treating other women as nothing but wombs. The hypocrisy, the sheer evil of it, filled her with a white-hot rage. "Someone has to do something," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. Griffith looked at her, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He saw the same steel he must have loved in his wife. Information first, he said, his mind already working. We need to know for sure what's happening. Who's involved? We can't fight shadows. They talked long into the night, their voices low and urgent. Landry shared every scrap of rumor he'd heard. They pieced together a horrifying mosaic of corruption and cruelty. When Landry finally rolled out his bedroll by the fire, Clarice and Griffith were left alone in the charged silence. It's dangerous work, Griffith said, his eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. Men who traffic in human misery don't hesitate to kill. I know what it's like to be thrown away like garbage, she replied, her voice steady. I can't sit here in comfort, knowing what's happening to them. I won't. He studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded. All right, he said, but we do this smart. The night they chose was moonless and bitter cold. Snow fell in a thick, silent curtain, muffling all sound. They rode double on Griffith's horse. Thunder, a sturdy bay gelding that moved through the darkness like a ghost. Clarice sat behind Griffith, her arms wrapped around his waist for warmth, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his coat. Despite the grimness of their mission, she was acutely aware of his solid presence in front of her, a shield against the world. Canyon Creek was a dark gash in the mountainside. The old mining camp was a cluster of ramshackle buildings, rotting skeletons against the snow. But it wasn't abandoned. Light glowed from the windows of several cabins, yellow and sinister. They left Thunder tied in a thicket of pines and moved forward on foot, shadows in a world of shadows. The largest building seemed to be a barracks or a saloon. They could hear rough laughter and the clink of glasses, but Clarice's attention was drawn to a smaller structure, set apart from the others. Its windows were boarded up, and a single bored-looking guard sat on the porch, huddled in a thick coat. As they crept closer, a low moan drifted from within the barred building. It was a sound of pure misery, and it made the hair on Clarice's arm stand on end. She found a crack between two of the boards covering a window and peered inside. The sight made her stomach clench. In the dim lantern light, she saw at least half a dozen women. They were lying on crude straw pallets, their faces pale and gaunt. Some were heavily pregnant, their bodies swollen and weary. Others were painfully thin, as if they'd already given birth. They looked less like people and more like ghosts, their eyes hollow with despair. Just then, the door of the main building opened, spilling light across the snow. Two men stepped out. One was a hulking brute with a scarred face. The other was smaller, dressed in clothes that were too fine for this remote corner of the world. The Denver buyer's getting impatient, the well-dressed man said, his voice sharp and cold. He wants 3 more by New Year's. Premium prices, he said, for healthy stock. We'll have 'em, the brute grunted. Got 2 ready to drop any day now, and the judge is sending up a fresh batch next week. A real prize, he said, from Cedar Falls. Clarice felt Griffith tense beside her, his whole body coiling with a violence he barely held in check. A fresh batch. From Cedar Falls. He meant her. This was where she was supposed to have ended up. They had seen enough, more than enough. They slipped back into the trees, their hearts pounding with a mixture of horror and fury. The ride back to the cabin was a silent, grim journey. The falling snow seemed to mock them, covering the world in a blanket of false purity, hiding the filth that festered beneath. By the time they reached their own small clearing, the eastern sky was beginning to bleed with the first light of dawn. I ride for Colorado Springs at first light, Griffith said as he unsaddled Thunder. I'll wire the U.S. Marshal in Denver. We'll bring the whole damn thing crashing down. But the mountain had other plans. Morning brought an ice storm, a freak weather event that turned the world into a treacherous, glittering trap. A thick sheet of ice coated every tree, every rock, every inch of the trail. Travel was impossible. For 3 days they were prisoners in the cabin. Griffith paced like a caged wolf, his frustration a palpable force in the small room. Clarice threw herself into chores with a frantic energy, trying to keep the images from Canyon Creek at bay. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hollow faces of those women. On the 4th day, the ice began to melt under a pale sun. The trail would be a muddy mess, but passable. Griffith was pulling on his coat, ready to leave, when they heard it. The sound of horses, not one but several, and they were approaching fast. Griffith grabbed his rifle, his face grim. "Stay inside," he ordered. Clarice ran to the window. 3 riders were coming up the trail. The man in the lead was tall and wore a long, dark coat. Even from a distance, she could see the glint of a silver star on his chest. "It's the law," she breathed, relief washing over her. They must have found out somehow. Griffith looked out, his expression wary. "Maybe." The lead rider reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin. He wasn't a lawman Clarice recognized. He was a stranger, with cold, dead eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. The men with him looked more like hired guns than deputies. "Griffith Cade," the man called out, his voice smooth and confident. "My name is Vernick Stiles. I'm a deputy marshal. We've had reports of some illegal activity in this area. Wondered if you'd seen anything unusual." Griffith stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. "Haven't seen a thing." Stiles smiled, a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's funny, because we heard a different story. Heard you and a certain lady friend took a little moonlight ride over to Canyon Creek the other night." He casually drew his revolver. "We can't have folks spreading lies about legitimate business operations. Now can we?" It was a trap. This wasn't the law. This was Crenshaw's private army. They hadn't come to investigate. They had come to clean up a mess, to silence the only 2 people who knew the truth. "Nothing legitimate about what you're doing up there," Griffith said, his voice dangerously calm. "That's where you're wrong," Stiles replied, his smile widening. He gestured with his gun toward the tree line. From the shadows, another figure emerged, leading a 4th horse. It was her husband, Thomas Vaughn. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He wouldn't look at her. He just stared at the ground, a puppet whose strings were held by the men around him. "Tell them, Thomas," Stiles purred. "Tell your former wife how she signed the papers, all legal and voluntary, how she agreed to be a surrogate for a wealthy, childless couple, all above board." "He's lying," Clarice cried from the doorway. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "Clarice, please, I was in debt. The judge, he said it was the only way. He promised no one would ever know. He promised you'd be cared for." "Cared for?" Griffith spat. "Like cattle in a pen?" Stiles chuckled. Now. No need for unpleasantness. We're just here to collect our property." He nodded to his men, who began to dismount, spreading out to flank the cabin. "You can hand her over, Cade, or we can burn this whole place to the ground with both of you inside. Your choice." Clarice's mind raced. Thomas's presence explained everything. He was the witness who would legitimize their lies, who would swear she had gone willingly. They hadn't just come to kill them. They had come to erase them, to replace the truth with a clean, legal fiction. Moving quietly, Clarice backed into the cabin. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for a weapon, an advantage, anything. Her gaze fell on the fireplace. Griffith's spare pistol was gone from its hiding place. He must have it. But there was something else. On the mantel sat an old ornate powder horn, something Griffith used for his hunting rifle, and next to it a tinderbox. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in her mind. "You're outnumbered, Cade," Stiles taunted from the yard. "Maybe," Griffith's voice rang out, "but you'll be the first to die, and we both know it." That was her cue. While Stiles was focused on Griffith, Clarice moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline. She grabbed the powder horn. It was heavy, nearly full. She ran to the back of the cabin, to the small window of her room that looked out toward the barn. She could hear the men moving, their boots crunching in the snow and mud. One of them was circling around to the back. She had seconds. She uncorked the horn and poured a thick, black line of gunpowder from the window, across the muddy ground, all the way to the dry, hay-stuffed barn. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the horn. Then she heard a gunshot, a single deafening crack that echoed across the meadow. Her heart stopped. Had they shot Griffith? "That was a warning shot, Cade," Stiles yelled. "The next one won't be." He was alive. Clarice fumbled with the tinderbox, striking flint against steel. A spark caught. She touched it to the beginning of the gunpowder trail. It hissed to life, a fiery snake slithering across the ground toward the barn. She ducked back inside just as the gunman rounded the corner. He saw the burning fuse and his eyes went wide. What the? The world exploded. The barn went up in a colossal fireball, a deafening roar that shook the very earth. The force of the blast threw the gunman off his feet and sent a wave of heat and smoke billowing across the yard. The horses screamed and reared, and in the chaos, Griffith made his move. He fired twice. Two of Styles' men went down. Styles himself, stunned by the explosion, was staggering, trying to get his bearings. Clarice didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and burst out the front door. Thomas was standing frozen, his face a mask of terror. She ran right past him, straight at Vernick Styles. He saw her coming and tried to raise his pistol, but he was too slow. She swung the skillet with all the force of her rage and desperation. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by the roar of the burning barn and the whimpering of the wounded men. Griffith was standing on the porch, his rifle smoking, his face a mixture of shock and awe. He looked from the fiery remains of his barn to Clarice, standing over the unconscious deputy marshal with the skillet in her hand. "My God, Clarice," he breathed. But it wasn't over. From the woods, a voice rang out, a familiar, booming voice. "U.S. Marshal, you're surrounded. Drop your weapons." Landry Croft stepped out from behind a stand of aspens, his old hunting rifle leveled. It was a bluff, of course. He was alone, but it was enough. The last remaining gunman, seeing his boss down and the barn in flames, threw down his gun and raised his hands. Thomas Vaughn just stood there shaking, looking at the devastation. He looked at Clarice, his wife, who had just single-handedly turned the tide of a gunfight. He looked at her not with pride, but with fear, as if he was seeing her for the first time and was terrified of what he saw. They tied up the wounded men. Landry, it turned out, had seen them riding up the mountain trail and had followed, sensing trouble. His timing couldn't have been better. As the adrenaline faded, Clarice began to shake. The reality of what she had done, what she had risked, crashed down on her. She had nearly died. They both had. Griffith came to her side, his hand gently taking the skillet from her grasp. He looked down at her, his eyes full of a raw, powerful emotion she'd never seen before. "You saved us," he said, his voice rough. "You saved me." "We saved each other," she whispered. In the aftermath, the full story came out. Thomas, under the combined pressure of Griffith's cold stare and Landry's folksy threats, confessed everything. The debts, the deal with Crenshaw, the lies. He had been promised his debts would be cleared if he delivered Clarice and played his part. It took 2 more days for Landry to ride to the nearest town and bring back the real law. When the territorial marshals finally arrived, they found a scene of utter chaos. A burned-down barn, 2 wounded prisoners tied up in the cabin, and a story so monstrous it was almost unbelievable. The raid on the Canyon Creek baby farm was swift and brutal. They found the women, freed them from their prison, and arrested the men who had held them captive. The entire network began to unravel, a chain of corruption that led all the way to Denver. But the mastermind, Judge Crenshaw, was gone. When the marshals went to his home in Cedar Falls, they found it empty. He had vanished, taking with him a sizable amount of cash. He had seen his plan go up in flames and had run like the coward he was. In the weeks that followed, the cabin on the mountain became an impromptu headquarters for the investigation. Lawmen came and went, taking statements, piecing together the judge's criminal empire. Through it all, something had shifted between Clarice and Griffith. The shared danger had burned away all pretense, all hesitation. They moved around each other with the easy intimacy of a couple who had been together for years. They didn't need to speak of the bond between them. It was a living thing, forged in fire and fear. It was Landry who finally broke the unspoken tension. He'd stayed on to help rebuild the barn, and one evening, as they sat around the fire, he'd had enough of their polite dancing. "For God's sake, Griffith," he grumbled, "are you going to marry the woman, or are you going to let the bravest soul in this territory get away?" Griffith looked at Clarice across the firelight. The question hung in the air, simple and profound. He didn't have to speak. The answer was in his eyes. That night, after Landry had retired, Griffith found Clarice on the porch, looking up at the star-dusted sky. "He's got a big mouth," Griffith said softly, standing beside her. "He's not wrong," she whispered, not looking at him. He gently took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Clarice, I've been hiding on this mountain for 8 years, trying to outrun a ghost. Then you showed up, and for the first time this place felt like a home again." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking you to stay as help. I'm asking you to stay as my wife." The word wife struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Griffith, you don't understand," she whispered, the old shame rising in her throat. I can't give you children." "Stop," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face. "Don't you ever say that again. What I want is you, the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. If we never have children, then that is God's will. But I would rather spend the rest of my life with you and no babies than with anyone else and a dozen of them." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they were tears of joy. "Are you sure?" He didn't answer with words. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss full of fire and promise, a kiss that sealed a bond forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Landry is a sworn justice of the peace," he murmured against her lips. "He can marry us by morning." "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and painting the meadow in wildflowers. Clarice Cade had never known such happiness. Life with Griffith was a revelation, a partnership built on respect, trust, and a passion that made up for 10 years of a loveless marriage. The world outside the mountain continued to turn. Judge Crenshaw was eventually captured in Kansas, trying to start a new life under a new name. His trial was the talk of the territory. He was convicted, his crimes exposed for all to see. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Thomas Vaughn, for his part, testified against the judge, and in exchange for his cooperation, was allowed to leave the territory in disgrace, a broken man. One warm May evening, as Clarice and Griffith sat on the newly rebuilt porch, they were startled by a sound, a baby's cry. It was coming from the edge of the woods. They looked at each other, their hearts pounding, and ran toward the sound. There, nestled in a basket at the foot of a large pine tree, was a baby. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in a clean but tattered quilt. Its tiny face was scrunched up as it cried, its fists flailing. Pinned to the blanket was a note. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "Her name is Grace. She is one of the ones you saved. Her mother did not survive the fever. I was her friend. I know who you are. I know you will give her a good home, a home she deserves. Please, keep her safe from the world that made her." Clarice gently lifted the baby from the basket. The moment the tiny infant was in her arms, she stopped crying. She opened her eyes, big and blue and full of a solemn trust, and looked right at Clarice. A wave of love, so fierce and so powerful it stole her breath away, washed over Clarice. It was instantaneous, primal. This was her daughter. Griffith stood beside her, his face filled with wonder, as he reached out a calloused finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Grace's fingers immediately wrapped around his. "My God," he whispered, "someone knew. Someone sent her to us." They never found out who the friend was, which of the rescued women had made the long journey up the mountain to deliver this precious gift. It didn't matter. In the eyes of the law, she was an orphan, but in this cabin, she was a miracle. 1 year later, the cabin was no longer a place of solitude and ghosts. It was filled with the laughter and babbling of a little girl learning to walk. Grace, with her bright blue eyes and Griffith's stubborn chin, was the center of their universe. Clarice often thought about the journey that had brought her here, the shame of the town square, the terror of her exile, the fire and the fight. She had been cast out for being barren, only to find that motherhood had nothing to do with biology. It had everything to do with a love so strong it could conquer monsters and a heart big enough to welcome a miracle. One evening as the sun set, painting the peaks in hues of orange and purple, Griffith came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as she held Grace, now sleepy from a day of exploring the meadow. "We're blessed," he said simply, his chin resting on her shoulder. Clarice leaned back against his strong chest, her heart full to bursting. She looked at the vast, wild mountains that had once seemed like a prison, but were now her sanctuary. She looked at the man who had been her protector, her partner, her husband, and she looked at the beautiful child in her arms, a daughter born not of her body, but of her courage. The world had called her cursed, but here in this home built on the edge of forever, she was blessed beyond all measure. If you believe that sometimes the greatest blessings are found at the end of the darkest roads, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below. What part of Clarice's story shocked you the most? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the next strange, dark, and mysterious tale we have in store for you.